The grand halls of international diplomacy often echo with voices discussing the future of nations, their walls lined with flags and faces of the powerful. Cameras flash, pens scribble, translators whisper, and deals are struck that shape the course of continents. For many leaders, these meetings are the pinnacle of their duty, a chance to stand tall before the world and negotiate terms that decide policy, aid, and reputation. And yet, on a bright morning in Ouagadougou, as convoys lined up to escort President Ibrahim Traoré to a critical meeting with the United Nations, something unusual happened. Something that would leave his advisors stunned, his bodyguards puzzled, and his people whispering in admiration for weeks to come. Because on that day, Traoré did the unthinkable. He chose a farmer's promise over the United Nations. To understand why, we need to go back to a dusty village just outside the city, where cracked soil told the story of hardship more loudly than any speech could. The rains had been late, the harvest thin, and the farmers restless with uncertainty. Among them was an older man named Seydou, his skin worn by years beneath the punishing sun, his back curved from decades of labor, but his spirit unbroken. Seydou was no minister, no diplomat, no official with medals or power. He was simply a man who planted millet, sorghum, and maize with hands that had known more struggle than rest. And yet, this man carried something far greater than influence. He carried the attention of Ibrahim Traoré himself. Weeks before the scheduled UN meeting, Traoré had visited Seydou's village as part of his quiet tours where he often left behind cameras and media, preferring instead to walk among his people without the filter of staged ceremony. There, under the shade of a baobab tree, Seydou had spoken. He didn't shout, didn't complain, didn't beg. He simply explained how the rains had changed, how his sons had left to find work in the city, how the earth cracked more each season, and how he feared for the future of the children who still remained. Traoré had listened. He had looked Seydou in the eye, and before leaving, he had made a simple promise. I will return, not with speeches, with answers. Seydou had nodded, half believing, half doubting, because promises were cheap in the mouths of politicians. He had heard them before, but there was something different in the soldier president's tone, something that didn't sound rehearsed, something that felt raw. And then came the morning of the UN meeting. The motorcade waited, armored vehicles humming like restless beasts. Papers had been signed, agendas prepared, and representatives in Geneva were expecting the Burkinabe president's voice to echo in their chambers. His advisors urged him to leave immediately. The meeting was critical, they said. It was about aid, about recognition, about showing the world that Burkina Faso's new leadership had its place at the international table. Missing it would send a signal of disregard, perhaps even disrespect. But Ibrahim Traoré wasn't listening to the advisors that morning. Instead, he was staring out the window of the presidential residence, his gaze fixed not on the horizon of global politics, but on the promise made beneath that baobab tree. He remembered Seydou's hands, cracked like the soil itself, and the way the old man had stood, refusing to bend despite the weight of his burdens. He remembered the eyes of the children in the village, wide with a mixture of hope and hunger. He remembered his own words that would mean nothing if he didn't act on them. So he did what no one expected. He told his team to cancel the UN trip. The room went silent, a silence so sharp it almost sliced through the air. Advisors exchanged nervous glances. One of them whispered, "Mr. President, this is the United Nations." Another added, "Sir, this will be a diplomatic mistake." But Traoré shook his head. "I gave my word," he replied simply. "And in my country, a man's word is worth more than applause in foreign halls." The decision spread like wildfire. Some critics immediately called it reckless. Some foreign commentators dismissed it as a political blunder. But in the villages, in the markets, in the hearts of everyday people, the news stirred something else. Pride. Pride that their leader valued their struggles over speeches. Pride that a president chose a farmer over the glittering stage of global diplomacy. Meanwhile, Seydou, the farmer who had gone about his day not expecting anything more than the relentless sun, was startled when a convoy rolled into his village. Dust rose, children ran to the roadside, and the villagers gathered in surprise. Out stepped Ibrahim Traoré, not in the grandeur of a distant summit, but in the simplicity of a man who came to listen. He approached Seydou directly, the old man's eyes widening with disbelief. "You came back," Seydou said quietly, almost as if testing whether the figure before him was real. "I told you I would," Traoré replied. And with that, what unfolded wasn't a staged event, wasn't a media stunt. It was a meeting of dignity between a leader and his people, a reminder that true leadership isn't measured by the rooms you enter abroad, but by the promises you keep at home. The villagers gathered under the open sky, their curiosity burning. What was the president doing here in their quiet corner of the country when the rest of the world expected him in Geneva? Children peeked from behind their mothers' wraps. Young men stood with folded arms, and women carrying baskets of groundnuts and water jars paused to watch. For them, life was always the same. Hard, unyielding, and demanding. Leaders came and went, their motorcades raising dust, their speeches full of promises that vanished as quickly as the sound of their engines. But this day felt different. Traoré stood before Seydou, the old farmer whose words had planted the seed of this return. No podium, no microphones, just two men, one with the weight of a nation on his shoulders, the other with the weight of survival on his back. The president bent slightly, not as a gesture of weakness, but as a signal that he was there to listen, not command. Seydou's cracked lips trembled as he spoke again about the rains, the failing wells, the young men leaving, and the worry that one day the land itself would abandon them. As he spoke, Traoré nodded, occasionally asking questions. How much water was needed for the next planting season? What seeds grew best in the shifting climate? How many children had left the village for the city? He wasn't just listening. He was calculating, thinking, connecting dots between their needs and the policies that sat locked in government papers. The crowd could sense it. This wasn't a man ticking off boxes on a political agenda. This was someone absorbing their reality like a sponge, determined not to let their voices disappear in silence. And then came the moment that left everyone speechless. Instead of making vague promises or assuring them of future plans, Traoré pulled out a small notebook from his jacket pocket. Right there, standing in the dusty village square, he wrote down every detail Seydou mentioned. Names, numbers, problems, ideas. The villagers looked on in awe. Presidents didn't usually write. Presidents gave orders, waved hands, and moved on. Yet here was their leader, scribbling like a student, every stroke of the pen a silent oath. "Your voice," Traoré said finally, closing the notebook, "is as important as any speech I could give abroad. Today I stand with you because tomorrow must not look like yesterday." The old farmer's eyes glistened. He had lived through decades of broken promises, of leaders who spoke with the tongue of foreigners but never with the heart of their people. But this moment cracked through his doubt. Here was a soldier-turned-president who chose the dusty soil over polished marble halls, a handshake with a farmer over applause in New York. The villagers erupted in cheers, not the orchestrated claps of a political rally, but raw, heartfelt applause, the kind that rises from the belly and shakes the air. Women ululated, children laughed, and men raised their fists with pride. They weren't just celebrating the presence of a leader. They were celebrating the feeling of being seen, of being recognized, of being told that their pain mattered. Meanwhile, in the distant chambers of the UN, the absence of Ibrahim Traoré did not go unnoticed. Questions swirled. Where is the president of Burkina Faso? Why did he cancel at the last minute? Diplomats exchanged looks, journalists whispered, and critics sharpened their pens. To them, it was a breach of etiquette, a sign of unreliability, a mistake that could cost him credibility. But none of those voices could echo into the village where Traoré now stood. For in that village, the credibility that truly mattered was being cemented in real time, not through speeches but through presence. Later that afternoon, Traoré walked with Seydou through the farmlands. The soil crunched under their shoes, the horizon stretched wide, and the hot wind carried the smell of dust. Seydou showed him the cracks in the earth where seeds once thrived, the shallow well that barely gave enough water, and the worn tools his grandchildren used to scratch life from the ground. The president listened to every word, the reality of the struggle shaping his resolve. He promised immediate action, not months of delay, not years of waiting, but steps that would start now. He ordered his team to bring in agricultural specialists, to assess irrigation possibilities, and to deliver improved seeds adapted to the changing climate. He told the local administrators to prepare the ground for cooperative farming so that the burden would not rest on single families. And most importantly, he told Seydou directly, "You will not fight this fight alone. Your country will stand with you." That night, as the convoy left the village, the people stood by the roadside waving. Not because they were told to, not because cameras demanded it, but because their hearts compelled them. They waved not to a passing politician, but to a leader who had chosen them over the world stage. And as the taillights faded into the darkness, a quiet pride settled in the village. The kind of pride that gives birth to stories, stories that travel from hut to hut, from town to town, growing stronger with each telling. Back in the capital, critics were ready with their accusations. International media spun their headlines. But within Burkina Faso, the story was different. Markets buzzed with conversation. In tea shops, men leaned forward, repeating the tale with fiery excitement. Mothers told their children about how the president had stood with a farmer instead of standing with foreign powers. And Seydou's name, an ordinary farmer's name, suddenly became a symbol of the bond between leadership and the land. By the next morning, what had happened in that dusty village wasn't just an isolated event. It was a narrative, a myth in the making, a story of a president who valued a farmer more than the applause of nations. And for the people of Burkina Faso, that was more than politics, it was dignity restored. The sun was just beginning to rise over Ouagadougou when the news broke across the country. The president had canceled an international engagement to keep his word to an old farmer. Some dismissed it as symbolic, others mocked it as reckless, but to the people of Burkina Faso, it carried a weight words could hardly capture. It was proof that their struggles were no longer invisible. In the presidential palace, advisors debated strategy. "Mr. President," one of them said, his voice careful, "the UN is not pleased. They believe this may harm our relations." Another warned about potential consequences. Aid withheld, investments slowed, whispers among powerful nations that Traore was unpredictable. But the president, calm and steady, reminded them, "What credibility do we have abroad if we have none at home?" A farmer's promise weighs more than a diplomat's applause. Those words spread like fire. Radios repeated them, newspapers printed them, and social media carried them to the world. Suddenly, the story was no longer just about a missed meeting, it was about values. It was about a leader daring to redefine what mattered most. And though critics tried to paint it as negligence, ordinary Africans saw it differently. They saw it as courage. Meanwhile, Seydou sat outside his mud-brick home, the same spot where he had spoken to his president. His neighbors came by, asking him to tell the story again and again. Each time, his eyes filled with emotion, not because of personal pride, but because he had felt the weight of an entire people on his shoulders, and for once, that weight had been lifted by someone powerful enough to carry it. Weeks later, progress began to show. Trucks delivered sacks of improved seeds, agricultural officers visited villages to teach better techniques, and surveys began for new irrigation systems. These weren't grand, overnight miracles, but they were tangible steps. For Seydou and his people, each small action was a reminder that their cries had not vanished into thin air. The world, too, began to take notice. Journalists who had once criticized now marveled at the effect. Commentators debated whether this kind of leadership, grounded in humility and personal connection, could reshape Africa's place in global politics. Some called it naive, others revolutionary. But for the villagers, the debate didn't matter. What mattered was the sight of green shoots breaking through once dry soil, and the laughter of children returning from the city to help in the fields. And there was another effect, an invisible but powerful one. Across the country, farmers who had long felt ignored began to believe that their voices mattered. Young people, who once dreamed only of leaving for Europe, began to wonder if they too could plant their roots in their homeland. And even city dwellers, watching from afar, felt pride that their leader valued his people above international prestige. One evening, weeks after the visit, Traore returned quietly to Seydou's village. There were no cameras, no speeches, no officials in suits. He simply sat again with the farmer, sharing a calabash of water, asking how things had changed, and listening as if no time had passed. This time, Seydou smiled, his eyes no longer carrying the same weight of despair. He spoke of seedlings growing, of hope rising, of neighbors working together like never before. For Traore, that was the true reward. Not the headlines, not the debates, but the quiet knowledge that dignity had been restored to a man and his community. And for Seydou, the story would remain etched in his heart until his last breath. The story of the day a president chose him over the world. The final lesson was not just for Burkina Faso, but for anyone who heard the story. True leadership is not measured by how often one shakes hands in glittering halls, but by how deeply one bends to hear the voice of the forgotten. It is not measured by applause from strangers, but by the gratitude of those who live closest to the land. So when people ask why he canceled a meeting with the UN, the answer will not be found in diplomatic memos or press briefings. The answer will live in the memory of a village, in the hope of a farmer, and in the example of a leader who reminded the world that sometimes the most powerful promises are kept far from the cameras. And as the sun set over the village once more, Seydou looked out at his field, the earth cracked but alive, and whispered softly to himself, he kept his word.